Harry Targ, and I'm the alternate introducer to the panelists. I'm a member of the National Executive Committee of Committees of Correspondence. Just a brief commercial. We organized this panel. We are a national democratic socialist organization, primarily in the United States. We have some literature at the table, but lots of other literature at the table at the registration desk. Our organization is made up of a diverse group of activists from all around the country, engaged in a variety of activities, from peace and justice work and solidarity work to organizing workers and to engage in support of immigration reform and issues involving class, race, and gender. We were interested in putting together this panel today as to try and interconnect the crises of capitalism and democracy in the United States and the world today, and the visions as articulated by people like David Schweiker. And our view is that we have to include a discussion of ongoing movements for social change, that is, really existing social movements. And we've assembled a panel of theorist activists who are engaged in a variety of these movements in the United States. Our first speaker is Paul Kriebiel, who's a former union parts worker and union president and activist. He's also a writer. He wrote a very interesting book on activism in Buffalo, New York in the late 60s, and is a collaborator on a collection of essays on a recent visit to Vietnam that CCDS is publishing. He's particularly interested in the issue of stewards' councils and planting the seeds of workplace democracy in unionized plants. Our second speaker is Janet Tucker, who's sitting across from me, who's the national coordinator of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, and she's the past chair of Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, a really extraordinary organization in the state that's not often talked about, that has a large statewide network of activists engaged in social change, and she's a retired nurse. And our third speaker, Kathy Sykes, is a longtime grassroots activist with such organizations as the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance, the Mississippi Alliance for Fairness of Nissan, National Organizers Alliance, and the Jackson, Mississippi branch of the NAACP. What I'd like each of these speakers to do is talk for about 20 minutes, and then we could have perhaps almost a full hour of discussion and debate, okay? So, Paul, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Harry. I'm going to begin with the title of the conference, and I'm going to make arguments that I believe will transition nicely into talking about empowering workers on the job. So Cliff Duran, one of the organizers of the conference, as you all know, challenged us to, quote, detach our lives from the corporate institutions by building alternatives. Sometimes that's easier said than done. We know that important work is being done in many fields along those lines now with cooperatives, alternative media, and so on. But I'm going to make a presentation that will argue that strengthening and building independently run workers' organizations on the job, and namely I'm going to talk about stewards' councils, also fits that description. When they're built properly, they do take on a life of their own in many ways, and they not only exist as a way to empower workers to improve their day-to-day lives, but when the relationships and the dynamics are developed in the best of cases, they really become kernels or building blocks of what ultimately will become a socialist society. The other point I want to make before I start my my talk about building stewards councils is, well, I think it's important to spend time on developing alternatives to capitalism. We can't forget that we have to continually challenge capitalism as well. If capitalism sees that we've created alternatives, some of these alternatives may fly under their radar screen for a while, but ultimately, if they see them as infringing on the ability of capital's desire and quest to exploit and benefit from new markets, sections of workers, raw materials, new ideas, whatever they think they can profit from, they're going to go to war against cooperatives or other alternatives outside the capitalist system. And I think I also want to argue that even those institutions that think that they're completely independent from capitalism really aren't. We're living in a capitalist world that dominates the entire world, and even when there were socialist countries that were led by communist parties, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and many of the others, and they attempted to build societies as much as they could outside of the demands and the pressures and exploitation of capitalism and world imperialism, they really never escaped it. And this is not the place to go into this, but I really think it's something we should think about and explore further. But I really think, in addition to the internal problems that each of these countries made, in which I think then led to the downfall of most of them, we can't underestimate the role that U.S. imperialism and especially U.S. capital played in working 24/7 to undermine all of these countries. We know recently what the U.S. did in Venezuela to overthrow Chavez. We know about the near genocidal war that the U.S. committed against Vietnam to, one, destroy the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the northern portion of the country, and ultimately stop the revolution from taking place in South Vietnam. We know about the criminal blockade of Cuba that's gone on now since nearly the inception of the Cuban Revolution. We can't underestimate the effect that this constant assault has made on these countries, and that they will make on whatever we do to try and create alternatives to capitalism. So having said that, what I want to talk about a little bit is building organizations really within the belly of the beast. Working with people who are employed by these major corporations, and they don't have to be major corporations, they can be smaller companies, they can be, there's the public sector, which is influenced by capitalism and by the capitalist system that they have to exist within. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my own experiences. I've been in the trade union movement since 1968. I began as an auto parts worker in a unionized factory in Buffalo, which is where I'm from. And that was where I was introduced to this idea of stewards and stewards councils. And then I'll fast forward to late 1990s and through the 2000s when I was on staff with Service Employees International Union Local 660 in Los Angeles. We represented about 50,000 LA County workers. I was in the health division of the union, which represented over 20,000 county healthcare workers. I was initially assigned to the second largest hospital. There's 6 public hospitals in LA County. I was assigned to Harvard UCLA Medical Center in the southern portion of the county. And this was a hospital of about 1,700 workers. There were 5 stewards. 2 or 3 were so burned out and demoralized that they had just about given up trying to do anything. And there was maybe 2 or maybe a third one that they were trying and doing the best they could, but they felt overwhelmed. As the union rep, I was getting 10 or 15 telephone calls a day from members saying the union is not doing anything to take care of all these problems that we have. We want to get out of the union. how can I don't want to pay dues anymore. This was a real negative situation. I started with the three stewards that said, yep, we need to try and figure out how to deal with this problem. They were overwhelmed. These are workers on the job who were overwhelmed by their coworkers with problems every day. And so we started meeting in a restaurant across the street from the hospital after work, and we tried to figure out first what was the scope of the problem, and after listening to them and me sharing the calls that I was getting, we really understood that it was a massive problem. It was in every department, it was in every building, it was all over the whole hospital. People had complaints. I mean, everything from improper staffing, abusive managers, health and safety problems, every conceivable problem that workers face existed at this facility. We knew the three of us, or four of us, counting myself, could not take on all of these problems at once. So we set up a criteria for doing two things. One, trying to handle the problems the best we could on a day-to-day basis, but doing it in a way that we would build a union. Because ultimately I knew we had to really build the union at the facility. A lot of the workers had this idea that the union was the full-time staff people that work downtown at the union office. And we had to change that thinking. We had to change it so that they saw, and not just from my arguments or anybody else's arguments, we had to show them in practice that the union was them. It was all of them organized together at that hospital. And so we developed a strategy to do that. So what we did was we determined that we would try to pick, rather than take on big global problems that were system-wide or hospital-wide initially, we would try and pick a problem that there was took place in one work area, maybe one ward or one work area with maybe 20 to 25 or 30 workers. And then we set out a criteria. It had to be an issue that affected everybody, so it wasn't just one person's individual grievance. And it had to be something that people felt strongly about, because a lot of times people will complain about things, but then when you ask them to do something about it, it's like, I don't really have time, I'm going shopping now, or, So we wanted to make sure it was something that they felt strongly about. And the third thing was we wanted to pick a work unit that met those other criteria, where there was either already a leader among that group, or where it looked like somebody could emerge as a leader, because our goal was we wanted to make them our union steward. We got a call from some workers on a ward called 4 West. It was a medical surgical ward that met the first criteria of about 25 or 30 workers. I think there was about 28 workers on that ward on 3 shifts. And the call we got from 2 workers was, this was in November of I forget what year, but November is an important month, saying management just issued a memo saying that if anybody on this ward is out sick in the month of December, for even one day, they have to bring in a doctor's note. The past practice had been, up till this memo went out, people didn't have to bring in a note from a doctor until they were out for 3 days. Now my initial thought was, is this the most important problem? I mean, you've got these staffing problems and there's health and safety problems, and I would ask them that, no, this is what we want to work on. And what I knew was that it really doesn't matter what I think is the most important. What's important is what they think is the most important issue. So I asked them, I said, do you think everybody else feels the same way? Oh yeah, absolutely they do. Well, I wasn't certain of that, and the other 2 stewards weren't either, so we had to find a way to test that. So we talked to these 2 workers about, what if we circulate a petition among the workers, we'll mention this issue as a concern, and do you think we could get most people to sign it? Oh yeah, we could get most people to sign it. We made a little list of the names of the people and who would be the most likely first to sign it. We'll go to them first. You get the stronger people first, because then the weaker people will feel a little more confident that they can put their name on the petition too. Because there's a certain amount of fear in a lot of these workplaces, right, that there'll be retaliation, so nobody wants to step out front first. And what we told them was, all right, we'll circulate the petition, but we won't turn it in unless we get 65% of the people to sign it. Or what number do you think makes sense? We've got the input. They said, yeah, that sounds good. So I said, well, how long do you think it'll take you to get the signatures? Oh, you can get them in 2 or 3 days. So we came back in 2 or 3 days. They had every person in the department sign it except for 2, and those 2, one was out sick and one was on vacation. So they had everybody that was there. So, okay, that was an indication that there was. All right, so now this is November, and the policy is ready to go into effect on December 1st. So I'm thinking if we file a grievance, they're going to deny us at the first and second level. We're not going to, by the time we get to the third level, and they still deny us, and what are we going to do, send something like this to arbitration? By the time the arbitrator hears it in a year or 2, this has long been the established policy. So we knew we had to do something before December 1st to send a message to management that people don't want to do this, and we're going to resist complying with it. So what we did, we tried to have a meeting with management initially. They put us off, so we knew the only way management had to have a meeting with us was to file a formal grievance. So we filed a formal written grievance and set a date for the grievance meeting. It was before December 1st, and now we had to really do some organizing. And so what we did was we went back over these lists. We had a numbering system, 1, 2, 3. 1 were the strongest people, 2s were kind of in the middle, which was most of the people in terms of support for the union, and 3 were those that we knew were really kind of not, supportive of the union. And so we had the number 1s talk to the number 2s, and we got people on board to sign this petition. Well, we already got the petition signed, so what we did is we got these people to agree that they would come to the grievance meeting. We talked to management. We said, we want 6 people to come to the grievance meeting. Oh, no, we'll give you 1. And we're lucky to do that because we're understaffed already. So we kept arguing with them, and I think we wound up with maybe 2, but that we couldn't get any more, and it wasn't worth fighting that. But what was important was, our goal was to try and get as many people to come into this grievance meeting as possible. People started taking their breaks, I think, at 9 in the morning, because this was a 7 o'clock shift. So 9 in the morning, they started their breaks. So what we did was, among these groups of 1s, and then the 2s that we talked to, that said, yeah, okay, I'll support this, I'll be part of this. What we did was we had at 9 o'clock in the morning, there was myself and the 2 workers that got released to come to the meeting. Well, at 9:02, 2 other workers came in, and management said, what are these people doing here? They're not released to come to this meeting. We're on our break. And we had decided to take our break in this meeting. So they sat down. So now we had 4 workers in the meeting and myself. We talked for 10 minutes. We made sure the 2 that came in on their break talked last, so that by the time the 10 minutes was up and they had to go back to their break, they were still speaking. And management said, hey, these people have to go back from their break. And I said, no, they're going to go back, I mean, what we're doing is trying to push the envelope as much as we can. Well, they're going to go back as soon as they get done explaining to you why this is an onerous policy and an improper policy. They're going to go back. Well, they're still finishing up, and 2 more are coming into their break. This went on for an hour and a half. Management did not formally grant our grievance and rescind the memo, but they didn't enforce it. People were thrilled. One of the leaders of the campaign became a steward. So what we did was we duplicated this, we took this model and we duplicated it in similar work areas all over the hospital. Within 6 or 9 months, we had about 12 stewards, and we set up an interim stewards council. After we got about 20 stewards, then we set up a formal stewards council. We wrote up a little mission statement of what we believed and what we wanted to do. This was all done collectively, so this is all bottom-up stuff. And then we also, they agreed that it would be a good idea to have officers, so there was elected officers of the stewards council. And the part of what we talked about as we were building this was that we're all in this together. The union means that an injury to one is an injury to all. So if something happens to somebody else in another department or another building, in the medical complex, it's still our responsibility to take care of it because we're all in this together. And we got buy-in from people right from the beginning that these were the principles that they believed in, and that was the kind of organization they wanted to build. We also infused in it what I call social justice unionism principles. The idea that we're going to fight against racism wherever it shows itself. We're going to fight to make sure that women are included in every aspect of the work that we do and are not discriminated against at the facility. We're going to take up other issues that are of concern to working people because we're all part of working families. We all have our family and neighbors and friends in the community. And so we were trying to instill and build in the consciousness of these stewards as we're building the Stewards Council that really ultimately we need to be responsible for the interests of all workers, for the working class as a whole. So we're trying to build in class consciousness with the building of the Stewards Council. Now, coupled with then fighting more of these issue campaigns in different departments around the hospital, we started holding steward training classes. And we would have one class would be on, we asked people first, what are the things that are most, give me like 5, I got 5 minutes. There's always a problem. Okay, so we asked people as the stewards, as people were becoming stewards, we asked them, what are the things that are most interest you? Because we're going to do steward training classes. Well, of course, the things they said was, well, we want to know how to fight the abuses of management. We need to understand the contract better. We want to learn to be able to write grievances. We want to learn how to fight grievances when we go into management, how to do everything. So we made those the main classes, but the other 2 that we added, and in discussion with them, and they said, yeah, sure, that sounds fine, is we said, look, we think it's important we have something included on the political economy for workers. In other words, people need to understand, why is it that the county says when we go into negotiations, we've got a budget shortfall again this year, sorry, we can't give you anything. Why does that situation exist in the wealthiest country in the world? Right? They said, yeah, you're right, why does it happen? So we included that as part of the steward education. And then the third piece was this, everybody had experienced filing grievances and waiting forever and then ultimately losing them and then appealing to arbitration and maybe they got there in a year or 2 and by then the person was either fired or gone or, people realized that justice delayed was justice denied. And so what we said was we really need to find ways to put pressure on management immediately when these problems come up. And that means uniting people in a collective way. So one example was some of the nurses now that were on the Stewards Council said, we filed a bunch of grievances with nursing management and they're not scheduling any of the meetings and the problems are going on and people are really getting frustrated. So we had a discussion in the Stewards Council, and after a long discussion, the Stewards Council decided that they would go as a group to the nursing administration. I'm in competition here with this. So the Stewards Council decided as many as possible. We would try and schedule we were going to walk to the nursing administration office, but we tried to set a day and a time when as many as the stewards as possible could adjust their lunch break so that they could be part of it. So we had about 10 or 12 of us from all different classifications, including the nurses, but clerks and lab techs, warehouse workers, everybody. And all of us marched to this little tiny nursing administration office, which was about this big, so we filled up the whole room. I mean, they were stunned, they were obviously nervous and upset, and right away one of the nursing managers brought up the calendar and said, well, of course we can schedule these nursing grievance meetings, and so we got out our calendars and we started scheduling. So the point is, it wasn't just telling people, oh, this is what a good union looks like. It was developing activities and including them in helping to shape what they look like and participate in them so that through their own experience they saw that this is what worked. This is what a good union is. And there's a big difference between, I'm not saying that it's not important to try and lay out in words what a good union is or what a good fight back is against racism or male chauvinism or all these other things. We should do all of that. But in order to really connect with working people and kind of the average person in society, we've got to be engaged in activities that they can participate in and learn as they do. So my time is probably almost up. Just like one last comment. In the course of building the Stewards Council and in the course of us getting to know each other and work together and spend time together, relationships began to change and develop in new ways. So in the past, when most workers at this hospital felt that they were alone and all of these problems were just pouring on their head and shoulders and somehow they had to cope by themselves, now they had a conception that I'm not alone. There are other of my coworkers that feel the same way I do, and we've already stood together against this injustice, and we were able to win something. That was the other thing we said we wanted to do. We wanted to try and pick issues that we could win some victory on, because if you don't win some victories, it's hard to keep people going at it. And fortunately, we were able to do that. We didn't win everything, but we won enough things that people saw a real difference. So there was a 180-degree turn from, we want to get out of the union, to, man, did you see what our union did last week? They were talking about it as their union, because it was their union. The Stewards Council was the leadership of their union. The Stewards Council meetings were open to all members, so people had complete input into the shaping of what the Stewards Council decided. In cases like that, and with a couple of the workers who were pretty advanced in other ways, I would put forward the idea that, look, really this is, in microcosm, an element of what a new society can look like. Imagine if this was going on in workplaces everywhere, and if this took place in communities everywhere, in neighborhoods, this kind of organization from the bottom up, democratic, member-driven, social justice-oriented. We're talking about something that really goes contrary to capitalism, and it's really what we talk about when we talk about creating a more humane society, namely a socialist society. And so, when these Stewards Council are organized in this way, they really become building blocks of what ultimately we hope will build into a socialist society. Thank you.
Talk about Kentucky.
Can you hear me? Okay, hi. Was Harry said, my name's Janet Tucker, and I'm really thrilled to be here in San Miguel de Allende, representing the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. Harry talked some about CCDS, so I would just invite people, if anyone has questions or think of ways we can work together, just to approach one of us. So I started out as a young woman, getting involved in various things because I wanted to make a few changes. But I am no longer a young woman. And I realized through all these years of struggle that really what we need to do is change. We have to change the capitalist system, and that that's the root of all the problems. And that only socialism can fundamentally right all the wrongs that we see. I grew up in the northern part of the U.S., but I lived past 40-some years in the U.S. South, and now I live in Kentucky. The South was very much a part of the progressive coalition led by labor and the African American people against all odds, elected and re-elected the country's first black president. Unfortunately for the working people of the U.S. and the world, electing Barack Obama did not right the wrongs. It is abundantly clear that President Obama is the head of state of U.S. imperialism and commanding an imperial agenda for a significant wing of the finance and global capital. At the same time, Obama and the progressive forces have been hamstrung by the far-right and neoconservative agenda. Funded by the likes of the Koch brothers, they are aggressively pushing an agenda. Excuse me, glasses fall down, I can't see through, read through the bottoms of it. Funded by the Koch brothers, they are aggressively pushing an agenda that is racist, anti-immigrant, and anti-women. In the U.S. Congress, and particularly in state capitals controlled by the Republican Party, the so-called Tea Party is orchestrating a radical right reactionary legislative agenda. This right-wing agenda is most firmly based in the U.S. South. This country's wealth was built on the backs of black slaves, black slave labor in the South. The specter of slavery still hangs over the area. The 12-year period of Reconstruction following the Civil War represents one of the finest examples of democracy in U.S. history. The aim of Reconstruction was the full political participation of the former slaves and the disenfranchisement of the Southern landowners. African Americans, Northern sympathizers, and poor Southern whites both built coalitions against the land-owning aristocracy to maintain political power. But Reconstruction, unfortunately, was brutally crushed with an alliance between the Southern slave owners and the Northern industrialists who instead wanted to turn their attention to the West. The Ku Klux Klan that was worked on behalf of the Southern slave owners waged a war of terror against the African American people and against any African American that attempted to vote or run for office. The South turned into a virtual battlefield where massacres and lynchings were commonplace. When the Civil Rights Movement heroically challenged the racist terror and succeeded in passing the Civil Rights Movement of 1964, the Southern states in their majority switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The South has acted as an anchor for racist, anti-labor, anti-democratic campaigns across the entire country. Only a vigorous mass struggle for democracy can turn back this assault. And in fact, the new populist movement in the country has been growing in the midst of this right-wing mobilization. Progressive mayors have been elected in New York City and New York, New Jersey just this last year. But really the groundbreaking happened, I think it was 2 years ago, and I think Kathy will talk about that with the election of Miguel in Jackson, Mississippi. So these are significant happenings in our country and really point the way to the future. We've had a socialist elected to the city council in Seattle. We got some folks in Seattle here. So some things are going on around the country. In the state of North Carolina, Reverend Barber has led a protest called Moral Mondays, where thousands have gathered in the state capitol to protest the far-right agenda of the state legislature. This movement has spread to South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and the Midwest states of Michigan and Indiana, and also, I might say, to Kentucky. Hundreds have been arrested and the struggle continues. The two main democratic forces in the long march for democracy throughout U.S. history is the multinational, multiracial working class and the African American people. These two main forces stand at the center of the broad democratic movement, and this is a struggle rooted in the South that has shaped the region and the nation as a whole. It is a struggle for democracy that is essentially the struggle for socialism. A system guided by equality and peace can only be achieved through a system that puts people's needs and the planet's needs ahead of capitalist profits. Only through building a united, broad-based, progressive movement is it possible to defeat the right and make fundamental change. It is in the class struggle of masses of people learn the limitations of partial reforms and prepare themselves for more radical, far-reaching solutions. Kentucky is certainly part of this history. Coal mining in many ways has shaped the economy and the politics of Kentucky. Oh, what do I do? There's a coal company that's coming after me. Okay. So the coal mining has really shaped the economy and politics of Kentucky. Kentuckians are wonderful, proud people with a rich history of class struggle and trade unionism. There's a pride associated with being a coal miner. And yet it was not unusual for the coal companies to hire black workers, often bringing them in from other areas to break strikes and sow the disunity and fanning flames of racism. This has played no small part in the history of Kentucky. At the same time, the United Mine Workers was the first integrated trade union dating back to 1899 and was put at that time in the UMW Constitution that prohibited a mine worker to also be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Throughout the history of labor, Kentucky coal companies have viciously attacked any attempts of the miners to organize. Many have been killed, wounded, and jailed. Union mines were closed down and then reopened later under another name with no union. It's startling to think that today, given the history, that there are no union mines in eastern Kentucky today and only a few union mines in western Kentucky. This has had a dramatic effect on the region. With the power of the UMW, the electorate in the state was pretty progressive, pretty liberal, generally voted Democratic, but now with no unions, it's become one of the most conservative. Today we see less underground mining, more surface top mining and mountaintop removal. This has not just caused the destruction of the beautiful mountains of eastern Kentucky, but it's disrupted whole communities with the destruction of the land and loss of clean water. The deep underground jobs have been replaced by machines, and while coal production has increased, jobs here have decreased dramatically. Coal jobs are down 30% in the last 3 years. The unemployment rate is rising, and the official unemployment rate in most eastern Kentucky counties and some other counties in Kentucky is 20%, and I'm sure it's higher than that unofficially, because we know how they do the numbers. There's vast unemployment and poverty throughout the whole region. And I think that this was a telling fact. The fastest growing sector, so quote unquote industry in Kentucky right now is temp agencies. It says something about the direction that work is going now. Kentucky is losing many of its young people. Tyler Offerman, a young student organizer, he recently related this story, and I quote, "Well, recently in Letcher County, I spoke with a young man describing the economic realities of living in central Appalachia, it's a mountain region. He told me that he had to choose between going into the coal mines and destroying the land I love, going into the military and being forced to leave my family, or illegally selling prescription drugs. This is not at all uncommon. Despite the tremendous capitalist assault on unions and the working class, the struggle for democracy is growing. In Lexington, we have a new organization called Young Workers Lexington, and it's been working with young workers throughout the city on various issues. And this year, they organized the first May Day rally that Lexington ever had, and it was sponsored by both trade unions and community groups. The rally was called in response to wage theft of workers working on construction projects at the University of Kentucky, many of whom were immigrant workers. So thus we had our first May Day rally, but I think it will not be our last. Every year, the organization that Harry mentioned, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, which I work for, we do a lot of work around mountaintop removal. And every year we have on Valentine's Day, I Love Mountains March in the state capitol. And it brings out every year over 1,000 people, and it's a very spirited occasion. It's a wonderful celebration to the land and to the people. And it also is giving notice every year to our elected officials inside the State House, right across the steps from us, that we aren't giving up on this issue. But we cannot rely on demonstrations alone. It takes patient day-to-day work. There's a really good film called Deep Down, which talks about the struggle of one community against the devastation of mountaintop removal. This was a campaign that was carried on door to door, neighbor to neighbor. In the film, Bethany May, community leader, and also a member of Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, told at a public hearing, "We are all victims of the same coal companies. It's just that you're at the top of the mountain and we're at the bottom." Just as Beverly did, it takes talking to people one-on-one about why their water is poisoned and why their kids can't play in the creek. and what happened to the jobs. But we must also talk about the future and building sustainable communities. Building sustainable communities in the mountains. I'm sorry. Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, working with some other Appalachian organizations recently, held a conference called Kentucky's Bright Future. Retired coal miner Carl Shope said, quote, "We have to create new and sustainable jobs. Look to wind and solar energy to create jobs." He said, "I believe in Kentucky's bright future. We have to organize for it, we have to dream it, we have to build it, and we have to protect it, and we have to organize for it." End of quote. In the city that I live in, Lexington, Kentucky, we have a housing crisis going on right now. 1 in 5 families can't afford to pay their rent. In 1990, 88% of the rental units in Lexington were affordable to low-income households. But by 1912, that had fallen only to 17%. And that grows every year. If we continue to get 400 more affordable units every year, we lose 400 affordable units every year. This has caused increase in homelessness in Lexington. Plus, these are the statistics for people, low-income workers. But there's the community that I live in, the unemployment rate's like 40%, and people are crammed in living with family and other people, and it's housing is for sure a crisis in Lexington. So we've rallied behind this campaign of affordable housing. We have gone door to door, talking to people about affordable housing and doing voter registration. We have gone to city council meetings. We met with city council members. In August, we've invited the mayor and the city council members to a breakfast, and then followed by a tour of quote-unquote unaffordable homes, just to see, so they can see the conditions that people live in. In 2004, we mobilized for a referendum in the city to fund public service, transit service. And we won it against, everybody said you'll never win a tax increase, but we won it. We were able to build a public transit system, or we have a public transit system. But at that same time, we started another campaign. We started a campaign for the restoration of voting rights for former felons in Kentucky. Because anyone convicted in the state of Kentucky loses their voting rights for life. And it's astounding and shocking when you go into poor and low-income and communities of color, and you're told, person after person you speak to, I can't vote because I got a felony. And you see the dramatic effect this has on our democracy. Going back in post-Reconstruction, many southern states enacted measures to disenfranchise felons, specifically aimed at thwarting the black vote and the poor whites. In 1875, the New York Times said that, quote, "The evident purpose was to prevent colored men and poor white men from exercising their right to suffrage," which is exactly what it did throughout the South. Kentucky now remains one of 4 states that take someone's voting rights away for life. This affects 250,000 people in Kentucky. 1 in 4 black men in the state of Kentucky have lost the right to vote. We started off with just a few people back in 2004 in Lexington, and we've built this into a statewide campaign involving many organizations. This year, 23 organizations came together to hold a march and a rally on March 5th, commemorating March 5th, 1964, a rally led in Frankfurt by Dr. Martin Luther King. And we came out on March 5th this year, over 1,000 people, and the central theme of the march was the restoration of voting rights for former felons. All 23 organizations signed on. That's probably one of the most important civil rights issues of our state at this time. Following Reverend Barber's approach in North Carolina, we have had our Witness Wednesdays. While not all in the magnitude of more Mondays, but with the same determination, Wednesday lunchtime vigils were held weekly. The focus was the House Bill 70, which is our bill for the restoration of voting rights. This is our 9th year that we went to Frankfurt around this. This year it went down to the 11th hour, and we almost thought we had it, and then it was squashed by the Kentucky Republican Senate at the last minute. So we'll be going back again next year. While these examples of a progressive movement does not represent all of what's going on in Kentucky, it certainly is at the core of it, and certainly part of the long march for democracy. Our work must be very grassroots. We cannot move beyond capitalism from above, only from grassroots. We need to be honest with people and learn from them, and constantly do revolutionary education. We need to be involved with and look to the young people. They are our future. It is this new majority that will usher us beyond capitalism and build a sustainable and democratic communities for all.
Many of you have read over the last several months about the exciting developments in Mississippi. Jeff is going to talk about some of those, including Freedom Summer or Soul Timers.
My name is Kathy Sykes. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to come and share with you some of the things that are going on in Mississippi. I'm going to begin by talking about my experiences working as an organizer with the Mississippi Poultry Workers Center in effort to organize workers in the poultry plant. Mississippi has very low union density, so the Mississippi Poultry Workers Center was indeed that of a workers' center. And it was based out of Morton, Mississippi. One of the biggest challenges that I encountered trying to organize workers to actually join the union, and there were 3 unions that represented poultry workers in Morton Forest and Carthage, as well as Hattiesburg and Laurel, Mississippi. They were United Food and Commercial Workers Union, Retail Wholesale Department Store Workers Union, RWDSU, as well as the Laborers International Union. It was really difficult because in the poultry plants in Mississippi, and Mississippi is one of the fourth largest poultry producers. I know in the United States, I'm thinking in the world. We produce a lot of poultry. But since the jobs in the plants are very hard and difficult jobs, it started off using, local white employees, but over time, as they got better jobs, these positions were filled with African American workers. And as they began to get better jobs, there was an active recruitment of immigrants to actually come to Mississippi to work in the plants with promises of good wages and better living conditions. But when the workers arrived in Mississippi, they found that things were very different from what they expected. Some of the workers were housed in trailer parks that were deplorable. Trailers were falling in, and there were like 10 to 20 people sharing an apartment or a trailer, and so it was really hard on them. But one thing that the poultry plants were good at, and still are, is pitting workers against one another. One way they would do this is they would give the immigrant workers jobs where they would have opportunity to make a little more money than African American workers, And so that created a lot of animosity, and it was really hard to bring them together. But what we would do at the Poultry Workers Center is we would have meetings and invite the workers in so that, and we would have translators, so that they could talk to one another and get to know one another outside of the work setting. And it seemed to work pretty well. Working in the poultry plant is hard. Workers end up with a lot of carpal tunnel syndrome, injuries from using sharp knives. In the past, without a union, the workers were disposable. When you got injured on the job, they would just go recruit other workers to replace you. But with the union growth in the plants, the workers had a collective bargaining agreement, and there were procedures around, if you're injured on the job, and what to do if a disciplinary action needed to be taken against you. And so, with that in mind, the union continued to grow in those plants. There has been instances where women have been sexually harassed in the poultry plants. There's an active lawsuit against one plant in particular, Cook Food in Morton, for sexual harassment. I've heard stories about workers being extorted from the supervisors, where they have to pay the supervisor to get put in a good place on the processing line, so that their work won't be so hard or that they won't get injured. And they've also sexually harassed women in order to get a better job or a job where you can make more money, because some of the positions they pay by the piece, production piece, how many pieces you cut up or whatever. And so you're able to make more money if you work really hard. So a lot of bad things were going on in the plant as a result of that. And how do you organize workers who are undocumented and living in the shadows and are afraid, for the most part, to speak up? These companies, they look for exploitable labor, and they really do exploit their workers to the nth degree. What we had to do was help the workers to develop confidence and the courage to come together and know that there's strength in numbers, and the plant is not going to fire everybody. So if you stick together, then you can work and make your conditions better. Okay, also I want to talk about the environmental issues of having all of these poultry plants all over the state. Environmentally, these poultry processing plants are taking a big toll on the water supply. The runoff from the processing, and also in Mississippi, we are one of the largest egg producers in the world. Cal-Maine Foods is headquartered in Mississippi. I had the opportunity to visit an egg production facility in Edwards, Mississippi, and I noticed that they had a pond where I guess the runoff from the chickens were going into that pond. And I also noticed that they had big mountains of chicken caca. Huge hills, so, and that all of this stuff is getting in the water supply. I know in Morton, Mississippi and other places, they would have boil water notices at least once a week. And, it's really bad. And then also they had like an incinerator, and there would be like white powder that would build up on the cars and stuff. And if you know what goes into processing and making these chickens grow, they have arsenic in it, in chicken feed. They have cement, and among other things. So this is actually getting into the atmosphere in these communities where these processing plants are. So, you know, and the fact that these companies, they have a lot of influence on local politics. So they're not catching much flack for what they're doing to the environment in Mississippi, because these workers, they really need these jobs, and the elected officials need the political donations that they're getting as well. I want to skip now to Jackson, Mississippi's effort at cooperative economics, and I'm going to end with the Nissan struggle, since we have a little short video. Okay. Jackson, Mississippi began this effort to form cooperatives under our former mayor, Chokwe Lumumba, mayor who was elected against strong odds. He had a history of being an activist. He represented the Black Panther Party. He also represented rapper Tupac Shakur. He represented Ashada Shakur. He was very active, and he actually won the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. And his thoughts on cooperative economics was that we would form this organization called Cooperation Jackson. And he was planning on using the city's money that we're putting in these banks and you know, and that we're spending on all these different contracts to help leverage the growth of a cooperative economy in Jackson. But tragically, 8 months into his term, he died. They say that he had an aortic aneurysm. But anyway, you know, after his death, we had to scale back our plans, but you know, we're still moving forward with it. We were talking about before trying to do the banks and all that, you know, but right now we're focusing on 5 areas, and they are urban farming, daycare, transportation, arts and crafts, and waste management and recycling. You know, we're moving forward with that. Matter of fact, our next meeting is going to be August the 9th, where we, you know, continue to put the structure together to try to have cooperatives in Jackson. I have a book that we put together, and the leader of our cooperative effort in Jackson is a guy named Kali Akuno. And in this book, and I should make copies of it, but it talks about how Cooperation Jackson grew out of the Jackson Kush plan. And you can actually Google that online, the Jackson Kush, K-U-S-H plan, where you can find out about this plan. But the plan is a transformative vision developed by the New African Peoples Organization, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, and the Jackson's People Assembly, started in 2007. With the effort to move Jackson, the state of Mississippi from worst to first in regards to income, equality, wealth equity, health access, and the practice of democracy. So, you know, if you want to look through this, you may. But originally, Cooperation Jackson is going to be centered around a federation of cooperatives, an incubator where, you know, ideas could be hashed out, a school, as well as a bank. But these plans are scaled down some, but you can look at this book if you wish to. I'm going to end by talking about the effort to organize Mississippi's first automobile manufacturing plant, Nissan Automotive, based slightly outside of Canton, Mississippi. And that effort has been going on now for 9 years, and the plant's been there a little over 10. The effort to organize the workers at Nissan has been met with all kinds of difficulty, because for some reason Nissan, a company that the state of Mississippi citizens invested over $1.3 billion in to recruit to come to Mississippi, has decided that our workers do not need a union. And it's so hypocritical, because if you look at the Nissan plants all over the world, they have unions. They have unions in South Africa, in Brazil, they have unions in Germany, in Australia, and even in Japan. And for some reason, their plants, not just in Canton, but they have a plant in Smyrna, Tennessee, and they fight against unionization of that plant as well. I think that Nissan is also racist at its core, because the plant in Jackson, that's where the workers are 80% African American, make $2 less an hour than the workers in Smyrna, Tennessee, where the workers are 80% Caucasian American or white American. And there's also something wrong when Nissan moved to an area right outside of Canton, Mississippi, a town that's 90% African American. They had the mayor to sign an agreement that the city of Canton would not annex Nissan for 25 years. They did that. And they caught a lot of flack behind that. So recently, they started making donations to the Canton school system in lieu of taxes, because they started catching a lot of flack behind that. And also, when we gave Nissan all of that money, they promised us that they were going to create over 5,000 high-paying, high-wage jobs, starting at like $23 an hour. But since that time, Nissan has hired a lot of long-term temporary workers. These workers have been working as temps for, like, in some cases, 5 years. 5 years, long-term temporary workers. And it's really ridiculous, for them to do this. And that's why, the United Auto Workers saw that the workers at the plant, they needed support in the community. So they formed this organization called the Mississippi Alliance for Fairness at Nissan, which consisted of local elected officials, ministers, community leaders, and others to support the workers, because, they were under constant threat. And the ministers, so many times, when ministers that are members of MAPN, they say, when the workers do better, the church does better. So they have a vested interest in trying to see that these workers, get the wages that they've been promised. Also, there has been instances where workers who support the union have been isolated. They've been moved away from other workers, so they're in an area where they're not even close to their co-workers, because they don't want them spreading the union bug. They don't want them to encourage their workers to become a part of the union. And starting off, it was really difficult, but now it's getting a little easier and easier. And although United Auto Workers has not gone up for a vote yet, they're getting really close to it. And I think even though it's taken a long time to reach the point where they are now, I think it's well worth it, and I think it's very strategic. And in the long run, I think it's going to pay off, because I really believe that Nissan North America is going to have a union. And I think it's going to happen real soon. So I want to, I also want to say that, you know, everybody, they talk about Mississippi being having very low academic standards and the bottom of the totem pole. But the workers at Nissan who have been trained, they are now producing 7 different vehicles at that plant. You know, so we have the capability of doing, you know, whatever that we put our mind to. And the bad thing about producing 7 different vehicles is that it leads to injuries because you have to change things out and then you're constantly changing all the time. But that's where they are now, and 2 workers that I know of have actually been fired for their organizing efforts. And UGT, the Brazilian union, actually walked out in support of the workers that had been fired. So Nissan rehired those workers back. One worker, Calvin Moore, got rehired after the students. Now we believe that workers' rights are civil rights and labor rights are civil rights. So there is a connection, okay? So in civil rights faction, the students, and there's a Student Alliance for Justice, and they have chapters in Atlanta, Jackson, Howard University, other places, all of Florida, you know, they're growing all over the country as well, Chicago. They actually did a sit-in at the plant when they fired Calvin Moore. And he did get his job back behind that. And also, during this June, was the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, where students from the North came into the South to help to register voters and to integrate areas and to fight for civil rights. So in that fashion, there was a big march and rally held in Canton up to the Nissan plant. And actor Danny Glover, who has been so very supportive. He's been so supportive, and also the rapper Common. Common has lent his voice in efforts to help to support the workers at Nissan. But one thing that they had in common was that it was Harry Belafonte who pulled them aside and told them, you know, you need to do something to help in the struggle for human rights. And I've learned that he's also pulled aside Jamie Foxx and Beyonce and Jay-Z. You know, so I just want to take this time to thank Harry Belafonte for keeping the dream and the struggle alive, and for talking to the young people and letting them know that, you know, if you forget where you come from, you will repeat the same thing. And we're learning with the effort to restrict the voting rights and all that, but that's another topic. So right at this time, we're going to show a little clip of the march on Nissan.
That's what we're going to do. Okay? So let's move forward here.
questions or comments? This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. It was really interesting. Can you talk more a little bit about the whole bank? I think you said that after Lumumba died, that's a lost scene. But was it like the idea of a public bank, like what Ellen Brown was talking about this morning?
Yeah, there was discussion about it.
Could you ask
So the question was just to ask Kathy to talk a little bit more about the idea of the bank.
Yeah, there was discussion about a public bank, but you know, Mayor Lumumba was willing to use the city's finances to leverage, you know, the efforts, and after, you know, he passed, then it stopped. And we have a young African-American mayor now. His name is Tony Yarborough, but he's more traditional, and he's not really just an activist type of mayor. But, you know, we're going to work on him because he's serving the remainder of Mayor Lumumba's term. And Chokwe's son, Antar, actually ran against Tony Yarborough. They went a runoff, but Tony Yarborough actually defeated Antar. And the way he defeated him was that a lot of Republicans crossed over and voted for him. And it's really funny, if you've been following the Senate race in Mississippi, a lot of the Republicans are upset because African Americans cross over and voted Republican for Thad Cochran. You know, so it works both ways. And we have open primaries, so they're not closed. You can do that.
Hi, my heartfelt sympathy to all the people who work directly with Chokwe Lumumba, for that loss. It's a horrible thing. And I just wonder if you could talk about how are people, because it's a very big shift to go from being the kitchen cabinet of the mayor to being, out on the streets with a traditional mayor, and I'm sure that there's a lot of grief, and I just wondered the different ways that you cope with that, and MXGM and NAPO and the other circles in Jackson.
Well, it's been really hard, and one of the reasons why it's been so hard is the new mayor, when he took over, he fired just about everybody that worked with Chokwe. He got rid of them. I mean, just this past week, he let go a judge who Mayor Lumumba had appointed, June Hartwig. And so, it's been really difficult. I mean, we've been talking to one another, everybody's trying to figure out what the next move is going to be. But as I said, the cooperative movement in Jackson is still going on, and it's going to happen, not on this larger scale right now, but, it might take us 3 years to plan and get it together, and, who knows, what might happen, but I really believe that, change is going to come, and we're going to move toward a cooperative economy in Jackson.
Anybody else?
I have a question for Paul about the sort of shop floor organizing that was going on, and particularly what the relationship of national leadership of SEIU or other unions has been. Do you see them as obstacles, other opportunities to get support, in a more thoroughgoing way than just an individual activist level?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Let's see if I can give a kind of a short answer. In Local 660 in LA County, there really has been decades-long struggles of rank-and-file workers to make improvements on the job. And I think it has to do with the makeup of the workforce there. It's a high percentage of African Americans, Latinos, a number of whites, a number of Asians, and a lot of other nationalities. And all of these groups bring to the table their own history and their militant struggles. And so that's helped the union in many ways. SEIU for many, many years had a philosophy that, kind of allow local unions to kind of do whatever they want to do. When Andy Stern was elected president in the mid or late 90s, I can't forget the year exactly now, he came in with a really good progressive sounding program, and initially, in the first couple of years, I think did do some good things. But without going into a real long explanation of what happened, he ended up changing, I think, over a little bit of time. Part of it had to do with a bruising battle with the Beverly nursing homes that went on for years, and SEIU lost it. And at that point, I think Stern pretty much threw in the towel and just said, look, we have no choice but to really get a better management, basically. That was happening while we were building these stewards' councils, but his message and his enforcement of his line didn't really reach us in Los Angeles until the latter part of the 2000s, which it did, and then they really did try and come down on the staff and the progressive workers who were trying to build this kind of an organization. So to answer your question, if you have a union leadership that not only support, would support this or agree with it, but help lead it, I mean, you're way much further down the road. But if you don't, it's not a lost cause, because after I was at Harvard UCLA Medical Center for a couple of years, I was assigned to the biggest hospital in LA County, which is LAC-USC, and there was already a Stewards Council of about 30 or 40. We built it up to about 80, and it was really powerful and independent. And once they got rid of those of us on staff that helped to build up the Stewards Council, and they tried to send in other staff that was going to carry out Andy Stern's, stop fighting, for the workers and just go along with management. I mean, they were kicked out of the hospital by that Stewards Council at LAC-USC. And they still basically run their own operation. And that was what unfortunately I didn't get to that part of my paper. So an example there, this is just one example, in that hospital, I don't know how many people know, there was a big statewide campaign in 90, what was the nursing campaign there, 98, 99, something like that. A law was passed in California. It was led by the California Nurses Association, but a lot of the nurses in SEIU and other unions really worked on this to get a ratio bill passed to set the number of ratios for nurses, one nurse for how many patients. And they set it 1 to 6 the first year, and then it went down by 1 in the following years. Prior to that, they were signing, well, in the worst cases, but 12, 15, 18, 20, and even more sometimes. I mean, it was outrageous. So we ended up waging, the Stewards Council at LAC-USC waged a fight to, even after this law was passed, the county was not implementing it. They still were assigning 15 patients to one nurse, and it was supposed to be 6. So we waged a shop floor campaign, ward by ward by ward in the hospital, and led by the Stewards Council. I mean, the nurses started it, but everybody else supported it. And then this is the Stewards Council newsletter that explains how we did the campaign, so I'll pass that out. I probably got long enough. Did I answer your question a little bit? Or? Okay.
Could I ask each of you, this is sort of my interpretation of the interconnections between this morning's presentation and this wonderful panel. Would you agree with me, and ask each of you, that there's a fundamental connection between the sort of grassroots on-the-ground organizing and planting the seeds for workers' democracy, or the Schweikert kind of vision, and that we have to conceptualize and work in both realms? And those of us who are working on the ground should remember the vision that people like David suggested this morning, and people who are developing the program, the visions that David have to be engaged in the practical work as well. I'd like your comments on this, all three of you.
I think that it's just a natural. I think it's a natural progression. As the workers become empowered, then the bosses lose their hold on them, and we move toward a more just working environment. And if that fails, there are alternatives. And as they stated this morning, as a lady from Cuba spoke, you know, we do need to have different models, and so we just have to work on that.
Yeah, I agree. That was good. I just, you know, I guess another way of saying the same thing is that I think it's really important that when we work with people and organize with people, we're just not organizing about what they're against, but they have to also begin to understand what they're for if they're going to stay in this struggle long term. I mean, they have to have a vision of a better future, and so I think the two are very, very connected. Otherwise, we see many people that have got involved for short periods and they just get totally burned out. Even they'll say, "Oh, you can't do anything." And I think the whole point is through everyday work is to show that yes, there is an alternative, and what that might be.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a relationship. I think that you have to look at every specific case on its own merits. I mean, in some cases, I know, for example, the Steelworkers Union, they've had some meetings with the folks at Mondragon in Spain, and you know, the steel industry in this country has been devastated since the late 70s, and there's not much left of it. And the Steelworkers Union, they're trying to figure out how can we hang on to the jobs that we've got or help create more jobs in what were formerly steel communities, which are now decimated because of the closing of the steel mills. And so they're looking at this idea of setting up cooperatives, and I think it's a great, I think that's a great connection, and I think that's a good move on the part of the Steelworkers Union to do that. And they're doing it, by the way, with the idea that these are going to be union jobs in these cooperatives, that there still will be a union there, which I think is very important. If you look at other areas or other sectors of the economy, I mean, in the case of where I've been working for many years, in the public sector, so in this case LA County, I mean, this is already a public sector, these are government jobs, and I mean, to talk about cooperatives with public employees wouldn't make much sense for most of them. Maybe for their sons or daughters or neighbors that don't have jobs, you know, maybe that would make sense, but really we see our main fight is fighting to make the public sector more responsive to the needs of the community and turn it into the best possible entity it can be, both employment-wise and service-wise, because we see that if that's done properly, that can be one of the building blocks of a fairer society. You know, I mean, the people who are managers in the county, and while we get in fights with them, I mean, kind of at the end of the day, they're not really the main enemy. I mean, these are people who, they've got jobs, their job happens to be to manage the county, and so therefore sometimes they come in conflict with the workers, but they're not the ones that have decided that the budget's going to be slashed, you know, for public services. That's the capitalist class has done that. So to the degree that we can weaken down politically the capitalist class on every front means that they'll have less ability to impose their will in public sector existing organizations. So in many ways we don't have to reinvent the wheel, we just have to keep fighting to weaken capitalism and strengthen the workers and turn these organizations into really organs of workers' power.
I thought that was a really good answer, and I just wanted to build on it a little bit, ask you a little bit more, is that, you know, it seems like when I sort of think about sort of, you know, building a new society from where we are, that some of it is about sort of models of socialism, which is, you know, like the county that you work for and those state entities making them as good as possible. And so some of that's about workers' power. And then some of that, there's a sort of next step, which is sort of imagining those state sector jobs as not kind of hierarchical, bureaucratic, but actually much more participatory. In other words, it's not just the workers asking for more from management, but actually sort of even a deeper vision, which I think is implied in what you're saying. I just wanted to say that a little bit more strongly, that it's also about, you know, sort of eventually building a more democratic, participatory state institutions.
That was actually happening. Can I take another minute just to respond to that, because you make a good point. Because of all the battles that the union had with county management over the years, they were getting sick of it. And so finally, when there was, you know, another budget problem, and you know, if we try and make cutbacks, the union's going to go berserk. I mean, we had strikes and walkouts and all kinds of things. So they said that, so in discussions with the union, they came with this idea, they called it re-engineering. And they set up these committees. They were made up of management and union. I know a lot of people are down on these management, labor management committees. I think you got to look at the content of them. I mean, if you don't go in there with a real clear idea of what your agenda is, yeah, you're right, then management's going to walk over you and you're going to use you. But if you go in there with your own agenda, I mean, I'm not afraid to go into a labor management committee with any management anywhere if we've got our people together on our side before we do it. And we did in a lot of ways. And so what happened was all of the initial cuts that they were proposing in services and jobs and other things, throughout this whole process of meeting together with management, and we negotiated over what the committees would look like, and everybody would have an equal voice and equal vote. I mean, ultimately, county management would make the final decision. We couldn't stop that from happening. But we did get a lot of power in the process of how is this going to happen. And so in some cases, we got, they had in 2003 or 2, or what was the year with the Measure B campaign, there was, more cutbacks were coming down in the county, and they were even talking about closing 2 of the 6 county hospitals, and we waged this big fight back, but also we worked with county management to develop what became a ballot initiative in Los Angeles County to raise money to fill in the shortfall. And on our side, there was a lot of us in the union, especially from the stewards' councils, because the stewards' councils were in other hospitals too, and they were the more progressive element of the union. They were pushing that we raise taxes on the very wealthy and the corporations just a little bit to primarily fund the shortfall. Well, the leadership of the union, which was more moderate, and the county management, we pushed that as far as we could, but they wound up with the idea of raising property taxes by a fraction of 1%. So it only amounted a very tiny little bit on every single property owner in the county. So it wasn't the most progressive solution, but it was a good enough solution that when we waged the campaign, and now county management was actually working with us on this, we ended up passing this. It was the first tax increase that's been passed since all this neoliberalism stuff has been unleashed across the country anywhere. And we ended up, it generated I forget the numbers now, $168 million a year, which was enough to save all of the 2 hospitals that were slated for closing. And really the way we pitched it to the public for the vote was that the trauma system was dependent on these hospitals staying open because the county shouldered a lot of the burden of the trauma system. So we ended up raising enough money to run commercials, ads on TV, and we did a lot of grassroots organizing. Actually, I have some union newspaper articles about it. I don't know enough for everybody, but a few people want. But in the ads, what we did was we talked about, we would show like somebody in a car crash on the freeways in LA, which happens every day. Everybody knows about it that lives in LA. And then it showed somebody picked up in an ambulance, the person in the ambulance was calling a hospital to say, we're bringing him over, and the hospital says, no, we're closed, we can't take him, we got to take him somewhere else. But it was a mother, and the mother was in the ambulance with the ambulance people, and the ambulance guy's calling, and then he calls another hospital and says, no, we're closed too, we can't take him either. And the mother, you can see the look on her face, and then that's the end of the commercial. We won that, real big. So that's an example of how if you pick the right issue, and if you've got your forces together organized well enough on our side, we can work with county management on much bigger problems that ultimately weaken capitalism. That weakened the power of capital in LA County by winning that campaign.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. I want to thank the people that organized this workshop, because I think how to get from here to there is very important. And all the other things being talked about at the conference, of course, are really important too, but how to get from here to there. And the theme of economic democracy is very important to me, and I resonate with what Dave Schweiker talked about this morning. And we talk a lot about worker empowerment, and I can think also about citizen empowerment, because we're living in a political and economic system that's stacked against us, and we know that. That's partly why we're here at the conference. But how to get from here to there is important. And I think the step-by-step, so I like each of the presenters. I particularly resonated with the first presenter about the work at ECLA for several reasons. One thing that I realized is that we don't all think alike, including people in this room, leave alone people in the society as a whole. And if there's going to be a successful campaign, the people on behalf of that, on behalf of whom that campaign is being waged, must wage the campaign. And if people are going to wage a campaign, it has to be about what they think is important. And I've been a part of enough campaigns in my life that I can come in with heartfelt, good ideas about what we ought to be doing, and maybe people don't pick up on it. And I might think, well, I guess they don't care. And as you pointed out, the idea that came up with what people wanted to work on first wasn't the idea you thought was the best idea. But with good judgment, in my opinion, he said, let's go with what the people want to do. And that's a first step towards economic democracy, because the people to be involved in the campaign on behalf of whom it's being waged get to be asked, what do you want to work on? Even if I have an idea that's really important from my background, so what? If it's what they want, so that's a taste of economic democracy, and that's a taste of power. Because then it's like, hey, these people working in this union care about what I think. And they want to back me up and working on stuff about what's important to me. The second thing that I think is really important is that it's winnable, which you pointed out. So then you get a sense of power. You go for something you want, you win. Say, my goodness, if we stick together, we can make something happen. It's not a vague idea anymore, it's a real experience in life. And it makes people's lives different because it was something they really wanted to have happen and they got it. So something that was important to people and they won. And it made a difference in their lives. And then the last piece that's important to me, and I'm not the only person that's ever written or talked about this, is at that point, your appetite for more. You know, it's like, hey, something I care about, we won it, let's go for some more.
I mean, just a little follow-up on that, the example that this gentleman just raised. I mean, once the people waged that campaign around the doctor's note thing, well, it was much easier to interest them in getting involved in other things, you know, because just the very reasons you said, you know. And we wouldn't have been able to wage this campaign for the nurses if we hadn't done all these other little small campaigns to help build people and empower them in the years before this campaign came along.
I just wanted to comment on the issue of patience, that a lot of these campaigns take a long time, obviously, no matter what we're working toward, and step by step. I mean, obviously the union movement, long time. An aunt who was involved in 1911 in starting a strike in Chicago. And in Jackson, what you talked about is you guys are still working on cooperatives. You're not giving. And in Kentucky, you've been working a long time on several issues, and including the issue of people with felony records. I have no doubt you will win. So I just wanted to comment on that, because a lot of times it's easy when you don't win the first time to say, well, we didn't win, let's, go do something else, go shopping, as someone said.
Thank you all for attending, and thanks for a wonderful